Nestled in the remote southwestern corner of Wales, Pembrokeshire is a place where wild beauty and ancient history converge. Renowned for its rugged coastline, dramatic cliffs and golden beaches, it's rightly earned its reputation as a holiday hotspot. But further inland, where the landscape shifts from the familiar to the mystical, lies a realm where legends and reality blur. It's often said that time moves at a different pace in Pembrokeshire, as anyone who's been stuck behind a tractor on its narrow country lanes will attest. But every now and then, in this land of sacred stones and saintly legends, time doesn't just slow, it unravels completely. In this episode, we delve into some of Pembrokeshire's most unsettling time-slip tales, stories where the laws of physics momentarily faltered, revealing haunting glimpses of events yet to come. In the late 18th century, Sarah Evans was more than just a farmer's wife. She was known throughout her village as a dewin or clairvoyant, someone with a rare ability to glimpse into the future. Despite her extraordinary gift, she led a quiet, simple life with her husband near the rugged Treffgarne rocks in Wales, occasionally foretelling local events like births, deaths or unexpected misfortunes, but nothing that would be of any interest to someone outside the local community. Their farm overlooked the steep and densely wooded Treffgarne Gorge, a place shrouded in mystery and legend, once feared as a refuge for highwaymen and robbers. The gorge, with its craggy terrain and impenetrable forests, seemed a world apart from the present. One ordinary day around the year 1770, Sarah ventured out to gather herbs on the slopes above the farm. As she gazed down into the gorge, however, she was overcome by the oddest of sensations. The world around her suddenly seemed to shift. The air grew colder, the familiar sounds of the 18th century countryside faded, and a strange sensation washed over her, like she was no longer in her own time. Then, in the distance, she saw something that made her heart race. Emerging from the dense trees, a line of large wagons appeared, moving swiftly along a path that should have been impossible to navigate. But what truly froze her in place was that these wagons were not being pulled by any oxen or horses. They moved on their own, in perfect unison, as if propelled by some invisible force. The lead wagon spewed thick, dark smoke, churning through the air like a beast from another world. Confused and frightened, Sarah blinked, and just as quickly as they had appeared, the wagons vanished and the familiar sights and sounds of the 18th century returned. She hurried back to her farmhouse, her mind reeling from what she had just witnessed. When she told her husband about the strange vision, he was just as perplexed. How could such a thing be possible? For Sarah, this was unlike any of the visions she had experienced before. Her usual glimpses of the future came as fleeting images in her mind, but this was something she had felt with all her senses. The sights, the sounds, the very air around her were as real as any other day in her life, yet there was no explanation. As the story of Sarah's strange encounter spread through the village, it became something of a local legend. Years turned into decades, and the tale of the phantom wagons was passed down through generations. Many speculated that Sarah had seen a prophecy, a vision of things yet to come. It wasn't until over a century later, on August the 30th, 1906, that the truth of Sarah's time slip was finally revealed. On that day, a steam locomotive pulling a line of carriages roared through Treffgarne Gorge for the very first time, exactly as Sarah had described 136 years earlier. Yet Sarah Evans's eerie glimpse into the future isn't the only instance of time slipping through Pembrokeshire's enigmatic landscape. A century later, another perplexing encounter unfolded on the shores of Milford Haven, where, for a few moments, the line between reality and the supernatural seemed to blur. In 1800, when the port town of Milford Haven was in its infancy, a prosperous wine merchant named John Warlow lived in an opulent mansion called Castle Hall. The grand estate overlooked the banks of Castle Pill, a small creek to the east of the town, and Mr. Warlow often took long walks along the shoreline, enjoying the peaceful solitude. One warm summer's night, Mr. Warlow was strolling along the beach under a brilliant full moon, the air thick with the scent of salt and seaweed. As he made his way back home, he was suddenly startled by the unmistakable sound of a boat rowing up the creek. At any other time, he wouldn't have thought twice about it, but on that night, the tide was out and the creek was nothing more than a vast stretch of mudbanks. For a moment, he wondered if his hearing was playing tricks on him, yet the sounds persisted, growing louder and closer. He stood still, straining to see in the moonlight, but there was nothing there. All he could hear was the rhythmic splash of oars cutting through the water, the creaking of the rowlocks, and the gentle swish of waves against an unseen hull. The sound seemed to drift right past him, moving towards the old quay wall where the creek narrowed. Then came the unmistakable noise of a wooden keel scraping against the gravelly shore, followed by the sound of heavy feet moving up the steps of the quay. Yet there was still no boat, no figures, and no visible source for these unsettling sounds. It was as though the scene was playing out in another dimension, but one that Mr. Warlow could only hear. A chill ran down his spine as he realised that all the familiar sounds of a summer night, the distant call of a seabird, the soft lapping of the waves against the shore, and the faint creaking of boats moored in the harbour, had all fallen eerily silent. The only thing that filled the void was the ghostly echo of the boat's arrival. Overcome with fear, John Warlow turned and hurried up the hill, back to the safety of Castle Hall. When he arrived home, he breathlessly recounted the bizarre experience to his family. He described the strange noises and the unnerving stillness that had enveloped him, as if the world had been momentarily suspended. It was only a few days later, when an enormous trading ship from one of the East India trading companies dropped anchor just off the shore of Milford, that Mr. Warlow was able to make some sense of his experience, although it undoubtedly raised more questions than it answered. While the ship was moored, it so happened that one of the ship's officers passed away. When the tide finally rose high enough, his body was brought ashore in a coffin, transported by a small rowing boat. John Warlow was present as the sailors guided the boat to the very spot by the old quay where he'd heard the phantom sounds, and as they beached the boat and carried the coffin up the steps, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he watched in silent dread, recognising every sound, the scrape of the keel, the creak of the oars, the heavy footsteps, as the exact noises he had heard on that eerie night. It was then he realised he had somehow experienced a glimpse into the future, not through sight, but through sound. The terrifying knowledge weighed heavily on him, leaving him always listening, always dreading what other ghostly sounds the night might bring. Phantom funerals and corpse candles have always played a significant role in Welsh folklore, said to be witnessed before deaths and disasters in local communities. But as we've seen with the previous stories, there are rare moments when the boundaries between premonition and a full-blown time slip become unsettlingly thin, turning a fleeting glimpse of another time into lived experience. In October of 1905, a young railway porter working near Cardiff fell seriously ill and returned home to Llanachar, nested in the shadowy Gwaun Valley. His family, filled with worry, watched over him night and day. A close friend named Dafydd, who lived nearby, volunteered to stay up with him one night, sitting by his bedside as the hours slowly crept by. Around 3 a.m, the young porter's condition worsened suddenly. Desperate and alarmed, Dafydd decided to fetch the man's father, who lived in a small cottage just down the road. But as soon as Dafydd stepped outside, he froze. He found himself surrounded by a large, silent crowd. In the dim moonlight, Dafydd could make out a coffin resting on 2 chairs, as if waiting to be placed on a bier. The sight filled him with an eerie dread. It was clear that this was no ordinary gathering. The crowd's mournful silence and the ominous presence of the coffin gave the unmistakable impression of a funeral procession about to begin its sombre march. Dafydd recognised several of those present, but not one person paid him a second glance. The chilling silence and the mournful hush of the crowd felt like an oppressive weight on his chest. Dafydd pushed through them as he headed towards the father's cottage, but no matter how hard he tried to move away, the crowd seemed to shift with him, slowly marching down the road. It was as though he was being drawn into a procession that only he could see. After what felt like an eternity, he reached the cottage and banged frantically on the door, nearly collapsing with shock. 3 days later, the young porter passed away. On the day of the funeral, as Dafydd watched in stunned disbelief, everything unfolded exactly as he had seen it. The coffin rested on the 2 chairs, the crowd gathered outside in solemn silence, and the procession moved slowly down the road, passing right by the cottage door, just as it had in the dead of night. So what do you think? Are these eerie experiences mere coincidences? Or do they suggest a deeper, unsettling truth about how time and reality intersect? Have you ever encountered something that felt like a slip through time? Or do you have your own local legends to share? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey across the veil of time, please don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on more spine-chilling stories. Until next time, remember, sometimes the boundary between the known and the unknown is thinner than we'll ever realise.